calendar, which never really happens. So let's say the day is 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. So do we say that we go until 6 p.m.? Or do we say Plag HaMincha? By Plag HaMincha being an hour and a quarter halachically before then. So maybe 4:45 is the latest time for Mincha. So on that machlokas, so Rabbeinu Tam makes a double jump. So he assumes that whenever Mincha ends, Ma'ariv starts. Maybe. And that when Ma'ariv starts, is when Kriyat Shema starts as well. Also, maybe. So therefore, he says, when you see people davening, Shalom, when you see people davening early and saying Kriyat Shema early, it's because they follow the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda felt that 4:45 was the cutoff time, Plag HaMincha was the cutoff time, so therefore that's what they're doing. They're saying Kriyat Shema after Plag HaMincha. And of course, at least this already has the advantage that Plag HaMincha is a much more recognizable target than these other opinions in the Mishnah that we don't really know what they represent. So, one of they're not even necessarily waiting for Shkia. If you wait for Shkia, it's already one of the dragon. But very often
that's just not the Messias that they're talking about.
Yes, clearly it's not Messias for the average Friday night. Right. So, and maybe even not Friday night. So that's part of the issue. So he's making a big double jump here, which is itself controversial, that Mincha ending means Ma'ariv starts, and Ma'ariv means Kriyat Shema starts. So therefore, you can follow Rabbi Yehuda, and you can say after dark. But then he says, wait a minute. But sometimes we see that people daven Ma'ariv, or daven Mincha rather, right up until the finish line, right up until 6. So they're not following Rabbi Yehuda. So is the halacha like Rabbi Yehuda, or is it not like Rabbi Yehuda? Right?
I missed part of the jump, maybe.
Yeah.
Why do you have to pass like Rabbi Yehuda in order for Rabbeinu Tam to say this?
Why
can't he say that? Meaning, why can't he say that you can say Mincha till 6 and then Ma'ariv starts immediately after? He's saying that Ma'ariv starts, that we pass like Rabbi Yehuda and Ma'ariv starts right away.
Right. So saying that otherwise, how do we understand how they're davening Ma'ariv early?
Right.
But then the other issue is, but what about we sometimes see the davening Mincha after this? So if 4:45, if you want to move the whole border over to 4:45, so fine. But that doesn't seem to be the practice either. We see Mincha being davened after that point. So, that could work too. Based on a very unusual line the Gemara has over there in the 4th paragraph. Really, it's not unparalleled, as we'll discuss. There are other examples of similar types of approaches, but it's unusual. The Gemara says over there in that debate, so you have Rabbi Yehuda who says 4:45 is the cutoff point, and you have Chachamim who say 6 o'clock is the cutoff point. So who's right? Who wins? Says the Gemara, they both win. Says David Kemar, it says Hashadol Idmar Hilchas Lo Kemar v'Lo Kemar. Since the halacha is not being decided here, not like one opinion or the other, therefore David Kemar Avid, the David Kemar Avid. If you follow one view, that's legitimate. You follow the other view, that's also legitimate.
So now the interesting thing is, I thought there are two different opinions, sometimes different minhagim, but you have to choose one or the other. It seems
So
here like you could choose one day and then the next day do the other.
Oh, so that's a very important question in the halacha.
Even the same day.
Right, so we'll come to that. And there's a fascinating analysis of that question that we'll come to in a second. Right, it affects a lot of different things. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes. You're right that it's very surprising on that level, and what's coming.
Nice.
Hey, well, whether or not that's true, it's not clear if that's true. So let's see if that's. It does sound like it, so we'll come back to that in a second. So apparently, so says Rabbeinu Tam, that's what's going on. That we have this flexible situation where either view is valid. So fine, okay. So you can find Mincha being davened at 5:59, and we can find Kriyat Shema being recited at 4:46. It's all good. Everybody's happy because you can follow either the view of Rabbi Yehuda or Chachamim. So, as we alluded to, there was a whole firestorm over this Tosfos, a lot of questions raised. So first of all, we won't get into it because it's very complex, but if you're interested in the double jump issue, which is a significant issue, the Beis Halevi has a tshuva where he talks about this. In one of my makom, we can look at the Beis Halevi in Siman Tes, where he has a very complex tshuva explaining how Tosfos comes to this conclusion, because really it's not an obvious point at all. That one could say that Mincha ends, and not assume that Ma'ariv starts. Why should they have to do with each other? So there's a time for Mincha, which is the afternoon, And Ma'ariv is based on its own calculations. Why should we assume that, if Mincha ends, it means automatically that Ma'ariv starts? Especially
you don't have the parallel with Shacharis to Mincha.
because Mincha is a half-hour dead zone in Israel, right? And especially also, it's not even clear what the Machlok with time Shacharis ends. So there's either a half-hour dead zone. Mincha starts officially at halachic 12:30, although that may be for technical reasons, right? It's not necessarily for absolute reasons. So Shacharis ends at either 12 or at 10, depending on which view is dominant. So whether or not it's so obvious that Shacharis leads right into Mincha, not necessarily the case. So why should we assume that Mincha leads right into Ma'ariv? Maybe Mincha ends and Ma'ariv doesn't start. Okay, so basically again in his Tshuva he explains, is a very fascinating explanation why that is. And in the context of that he also raises the other issue, which is even stronger, which is just because Ma'ariv starts, how do you know that Kriya Shema starts? In fact, that's our whole premise, is that that's not the case. That we've already accepted the fact that we can be davening Ma'ariv early, and that's not good enough for Kriya Shema, because just as Mincha ending is not the time for Ma'ariv starting, Ma'ariv and Kriya Shema don't have the same time. Kriya Shema is Zman Shchiva, the time that we're sleeping, and Ma'ariv starts apparently at nighttime. Ma'ariv is we'll talk eventually when we consider the whole issue of Ma'ariv. So the Gemara is going to say that the Tfilos either parallel the Avos, as we're reading in the Chumash nowadays, or they parallel the Karbanos, or both, and possibly both. So to the extent they parallel the Karbanos, so Shacharis was the Talmud of the morning, Mincha was the Talmud of the afternoon, and Ma'ariv is a whole different structure. Ma'ariv is about the burning of the fats in the limbs from the Talmud, which was really a little bit earlier. So it's got its own standard. It has nothing to do with the Zman Shchiva of Kriya Shema. So that issue is one of the issues that's debated in terms of figuring out where Rabbeinu Tam is coming from. But others have a different issue, and this is going to touch very much on what Moshe raised. Shagas Aryeh. Shagas Aryeh, as we know, is one of the great earlier Achronim. He was older than the Vilna Gaon. And he has this very chashuv sefer on halacha in general, and he talks a lot about topics of Brochas. So in Siman Gimel, the Shagas Aryeh is very upset with Rabbeinu Tam. Shagas Aryeh in general, you should know, early Achron was not afraid of the Rishonim at all. Had no intimidation factor on taking on Rishonim, and he could be very severe. And there's some legend that towards the end of his life, a bookshelf fell on him, and that all the Svarim that he had attacked were jumping on him, and a whole story like that. And so he asked Mechila from all of them, and they all were mochel him except for the Levush. I don't know how anyone knows this, but that's Pshat in the Pasuk. The Pasuk says, Ari Yashag, Milo Yira, the lion roars, who's not afraid? Me is Rashi Tevis Mordechai Yafu. So Yafu was the bush. He was the only one who wasn't. I don't know again where anyone knows this from, but that's the legend. So Shagas Aryeh had no problem saying he thinks Rabbeinu Tam is wrong, but he comes at it from the following point, and as we'll see, this point is possibly debatable. And it ties into what Moshe was. We mentioned last week, that the widespread assumption is that Kriya Shema is a mitzvah min haTorah. That's how we assume for all intents and purposes. We also mentioned the fact that not 100% of the Rishonim felt like that. More like 95% of the Rishonim felt like that. That there are a few scattered comments in Tosfos and the Tosfos in Sota, Tosfos in Menachos. There was an opinion in the Gemara that Kriya Shema is really a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, and that opinion has not prevailed. Says the Shagas Aryeh, apparently Rabbeinu Tam must be part of that list. Rabbeinu Tam must be assuming that Kriya Shema is d'Rabbanan. Because he says this whole idea that you can paskin like either view, David Kamar Avid, the David Kamar Avid. So what's the basis of such a thing? Why would you maintain such an idea? He says it must be a reflection of the principle of Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. We have an issue of rabbinical law, and it's not determined what the truth is, so then you have a right to be lenient. So says the Shagas Aryeh, when the Gemara said you could follow either Rabbi Yehuda or Chachamim, it was a function of this idea of Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula, that you have a right to follow the lenient view. So if that's the case, okay. So the Gemara says it in the context of Mincha. The Gemara is talking about davening. So davening, according to everybody, is D'Rabbanan. We assume Shmona Esrei for sure. Mincha is definitely Rabbanan according to everybody. Almost all the Rishonim hold Tefillah B'chlal as Rabbanan. The Rambam maintained that Tefillah every day is Minat Torah, but that was one Tefillah Minat Torah. Say, already by the time you get to Mincha, you're for sure not Mitzvah Minat Torah anymore. So Mincha is for sure a Din Rabbanan according to everybody. So says the Shakasari, yes, so I'm not sure if I can daven Mincha or not, so fine, Safek Rabbanan L'Kula. So we can follow either view in terms of Mincha. But what right does Rabbeinu Tam have to apply that logic to Kriya Shema? Kriya Shema is a mitzvah Minat Torah. So Shakasari says the only way this could make sense is if Rabbeinu Tam is part of that club that says that Kriya Shema is D'Rabbanan, and therefore we have to reject his view, because that view is not true. He's part of that group, and that group is wrong. That was the Shakasari's view. One could say differently. One could take a different approach to this whole view of Rabbeinu Tam without necessarily paskening like him, but in terms of understanding where he's coming from. That one could say as follows. There is a whole discussion. What about the question that Moshe was asking? Right? Let's say we assume that it's true that you could follow either Rabbi Yehuda or Chachamim. You could decide that the cutoff time is 4:45, or you could decide the cutoff time is 6. Do you have the right to switch from day to day? Or do you have the right to switch even within the same day? And so as he pointed out, normally, okay, we know in many areas of halacha there's different opinions, but if I ask a question, it's normally assumed I'll follow one opinion. I'm not going to flip back and forth from one day to the next. So is this different than that? Or is this the same? So there's a fascinating analysis of this issue. The Steipler Gaon, Kilos Yaakov, has a essay about this. The first essay in his Sefer and his set of Svarim on Shas, he has an essay about this. It's a fascinating analysis. He says, well, what's the story? Can you switch from day to day? One day you want to daven late mincha, the next day you want to daven early ma'ariv. Can you go do whatever you want every day? So he suggests that it's based on the following analysis. So as he notes, this is really a fascinating idea, that this whole unusual formulation of paskin like whichever view you want. So what's that based on? So he notes that if you look in the Rush, in his commentary here, the first Mishnah in Brochas, and you look in the Meiri, in his commentary over there in the fourth paragraph where that Machlokas is, you find they use different models to discuss this issue. And those models tell the whole story. So what are those models? The Rush compares this to a Gemara in Erevin on Daf Zayin. The Gemara there has a debate between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai about a case called Shedra Vigulgolas, a situation of a skeleton of an animal. Shedra is a